The first rays of dawn painted the Hawaiian sky in gentle pastels on December 7, 1941, as Seaman First Class James Ward stepped onto the deck of the USS Arizona. The 20-year-old from Oklahoma had no idea that within hours, his world, and America's place in it, would be forever transformed by what President Franklin Delano Roosevelt would immortalize as a date which will live in infamy. At precisely 7:55 in the morning, the tranquil Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor erupted into chaos as the first wave of Japanese aircraft descended from the northwest. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the assault, his voice crackling over the radio with the code words, "Tora, Tora, Tora," signaling that complete surprise had been achieved. The carefully orchestrated attack, planned by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, represented Japan's desperate gambit to cripple American naval power in the Pacific before the United States could fully mobilize its industrial might. The sleeping giant of Pearl Harbor awoke to the thunder of bombs and the scream of diving aircraft. The USS Arizona, moored along Battleship Row, became ground zero for the most devastating blow of the attack when a 1,600-pound armor-piercing bomb penetrated her forward magazine at 8:06. The explosion that followed lifted the massive battleship's bow clear out of the water, creating a fireball that could be seen from miles away. In that single catastrophic moment, 1,177 sailors and Marines perished, including Seaman Ward, whose morning had begun with such peaceful promise. Across the harbor, similar scenes of destruction unfolded with mechanical precision. The USS Oklahoma capsized after taking multiple torpedo hits, trapping hundreds of sailors below decks. The USS West Virginia settled into the harbor mud, her superstructure ablaze. The USS California, USS Nevada, USS Pennsylvania, USS Maryland, and USS Tennessee all sustained varying degrees of damage as Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with clinical efficiency. According to historical accounts documented in the National Archives, the attack force consisted of 353 aircraft launched from 6 aircraft carriers positioned 230 miles north of Oahu. The Japanese had achieved complete tactical surprise, catching the American Pacific Fleet at its most vulnerable moment. Most of the ship's anti-aircraft guns were unmanned, ammunition was locked away in accordance with peacetime protocols, and many officers were ashore enjoying their Sunday morning liberty. The human cost was staggering and immediate. By the time the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon at approximately 9:45, 2,403 Americans lay dead, with another 1,178 wounded. The material losses were equally devastating. 4 battleships sunk, 4 damaged, 3 cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers damaged, and 188 aircraft destroyed. The infrastructure of America's primary Pacific naval base lay in smoking ruins. Yet even as the smoke still rose from the burning ships, something profound was stirring in the American consciousness. The isolationist sentiment that had dominated American foreign policy since the end of the Great War began to evaporate like morning mist. In cities across the continent, Americans gathered around radios to hear the first fragmentary reports of the attack. The mood was one of shock, then anger, then grim determination. President Roosevelt, informed of the attack while having lunch at the White House, immediately began crafting the response that would fundamentally alter America's role in world affairs. The era of American isolationism was ending in the flames of Pearl Harbor, and with it would come a complete transformation of how the United States viewed its responsibilities on the global stage. The smoke had barely cleared from Pearl Harbor when the full magnitude of December 7th's events began to reverberate through the corridors of power in Washington. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his face grave with the weight of momentous decision, worked through the night of December 7th with his closest advisors, crafting a response that would forever alter the trajectory of American foreign policy. Secretary of War Henry Louis Stimson and Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox provided Roosevelt with the stark reality of the losses. The Pacific Fleet, America's primary deterrent against Japanese expansion, had been dealt a crippling blow. Admiral Husband Edward Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Walter Campbell Short, commanding general of the Hawaiian Department, found themselves in the unenviable position of explaining how the world's most powerful navy had been caught so completely off guard. The President's War Cabinet convened in emergency session as reports continued to stream in from the Pacific. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who had been meeting with Japanese envoys Kichisaburo Nomura and Saburo Kurusu at the very moment of the attack, expressed the administration's sense of betrayal at Japan's duplicity. The Japanese delegation had been conducting peace negotiations even as their nation's aircraft carriers steamed toward Hawaiian waters. On December 8th, at 12:30 in the afternoon, Roosevelt appeared before a joint session of Congress to deliver what would become one of the most consequential speeches in American history. His words, carried live over radio networks to a nation still reeling from shock, marked the end of America's isolationist experiment. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The congressional response was swift and nearly unanimous. Within an hour of Roosevelt's address, both houses of Congress had declared war on Japan, with only Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana dissenting. The vote in the House of Representatives was 488 to 1. The Senate vote was 82 to 0. America had officially entered the Second World War, abandoning over 2 decades of carefully maintained neutrality. Historical documentation from the Roosevelt Presidential Library reveals the dramatic shift in public opinion that occurred virtually overnight. Polls conducted by George Gallup showed that American support for entering the war jumped from 39% in November 1941 to over 90% by December 10th. The attack had accomplished something that months of Roosevelt's careful persuasion could not. It had united the American people behind the necessity of global engagement. The immediate military response reflected this new reality. General George Catlett Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, initiated the largest mobilization in American history. The Selective Training and Service Act, passed the previous year amid heated debate, now became the engine for recruiting 16 million Americans into military service. Factory production lines across the nation began retooling for wartime production under the direction of the newly created War Production Board. Admiral Ernest Joseph King, who would soon replace the dismissed Admiral Kimmel as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, began planning the naval strategy that would carry American forces across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. The doctrine of decisive battle that had dominated naval thinking since Alfred Thayer Mahan was about to give way to a new concept: the projection of power through carrier-based aviation and amphibious assault. The psychological impact on the American psyche was equally profound. The sense of invulnerability that geographic isolation had provided for over a century had been shattered in a single morning. Americans now understood that distance no longer guaranteed security in an age of modern warfare. This realization would drive a fundamental reassessment of America's role in global affairs, setting the stage for the emergence of the United States as a global superpower committed to maintaining international order through strength and alliances. The weeks following Pearl Harbor witnessed a complete metamorphosis of American strategic thinking. The Roosevelt administration, previously constrained by isolationist sentiment and congressional reluctance to engage in foreign conflicts, now found itself with unprecedented freedom to reshape America's approach to international relations. The attack had provided the catalyst for changes that would define American foreign policy for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Secretary of Defense Henry Louis Stimson, working closely with the newly formed Joint Chiefs of Staff, initiated a comprehensive review of American military doctrine. The traditional focus on hemispheric defense, codified in the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, was rapidly expanding to encompass global responsibilities. General Marshall, in coordination with Admiral King and General Henry Harley Arnold of the Army Air Forces, began developing what would become known as the Germany First strategy, despite the immediate emotional desire for revenge against Japan. This strategic decision reflected a sophisticated understanding of geopolitical realities that would have been impossible to implement before Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt and his advisors recognized that Nazi Germany represented the greater long-term threat to American interests and democratic values. The Lend-Lease program, already providing crucial aid to Britain and the Soviet Union, was dramatically expanded. By early 1942, American factories were producing war materials not just for American forces, but for allies across the globe. The transformation extended beyond military strategy to encompass fundamental changes in economic policy. The conversion to a wartime economy required unprecedented government intervention in private industry. Donald Marr Nelson, head of the War Production Board, oversaw the redirection of American industrial capacity toward military production. Automobile plants began producing tanks and aircraft engines, shipyards expanded to build the Liberty ships that would carry American goods across dangerous seas, and new factories sprouted across the landscape to meet the insatiable demand for weapons and equipment. Intelligence operations, previously a minor component of American government, suddenly became a national priority. General William Joseph Donovan, appointed by Roosevelt to head the newly created Office of Strategic Services, began building America's first comprehensive intelligence network. The OSS would become the predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency, representing a permanent commitment to global intelligence gathering that would have been unthinkable before Pearl Harbor. The diplomatic revolution was equally dramatic. Secretary Hull, despite his advanced age, embarked on a series of negotiations that would establish the framework for post-war international cooperation. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Spencer Churchill in August 1941, now became the foundation for a broader alliance system. The United Nations, conceived in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, represented America's commitment to permanent international engagement rather than the retreat into isolationism that had followed the Great War. Research from the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library demonstrates how Pearl Harbor fundamentally altered American perceptions of national security. The concept of forward defense, engaging threats before they could reach American shores, became central to strategic planning. This represented a complete reversal of the traditional American preference for responding to threats only after they had materialized directly. The bureaucratic machinery of government expanded rapidly to meet these new global responsibilities. The State Department, previously a small organization focused primarily on routine diplomatic functions, began recruiting specialists in regional affairs, economic policy, and strategic planning. The War Department and Navy Department, soon to be unified under the National Security Act of 1947, initiated joint planning processes that would become the foundation for modern American military organization. Most significantly, Pearl Harbor shattered the illusion that America could remain prosperous and secure while remaining aloof from global conflicts. The attack demonstrated that in an interconnected world, American interests extended far beyond the Western Hemisphere, and that those interests required active protection through military strength and diplomatic engagement. The transformation of American foreign policy following Pearl Harbor was inseparable from the nation's unprecedented economic mobilization. Within months of the attack, the United States had embarked on the largest industrial expansion in human history, fundamentally altering not only how America projected power globally, but also establishing the economic foundation for its emergence as the world's dominant superpower. The scale of this mobilization was staggering. James Forrestal, who would become Secretary of Defense in 1947, later described the period as the greatest economic miracle in history. By the end of 1942, American war production exceeded the combined output of Germany, Japan, and Italy. This industrial might became the bedrock of a new strategic doctrine, The United States would maintain global influence through its ability to support allies and overwhelm adversaries through sheer productive capacity. General Motors, under the leadership of Charles Irwin Wilson, converted its automotive production lines to manufacture tanks, aircraft engines, and artillery shells. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, designed by Charles Sorensen of Ford Motor Company, became a symbol of American industrial prowess, producing B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 per hour by 1944. This transformation demonstrated to the world, and to American policymakers, that the United States possessed the industrial base necessary to sustain global military commitments indefinitely. The Liberty Ship program, overseen by Admiral Emery Scott Land of the Maritime Commission, exemplified this new approach to power projection. Henry John Kaiser's shipyards revolutionized naval construction, reducing the time needed to build a cargo vessel from months to weeks. By war's end, American shipyards had launched over 2,700 Liberty ships, creating the merchant marine capacity necessary to supply allies across the globe. This achievement laid the groundwork for the Marshall Plan and subsequent American commitments to global economic stability. The aircraft production surge was equally remarkable. Donald Wills Douglas, founder of Douglas Aircraft Company, collaborated with the Army Air Forces to produce transport aircraft that would carry American influence to every corner of the globe. By 1944, American factories were producing nearly 100,000 aircraft annually, creating the air transport capability that would become essential to post-war American diplomacy and military intervention. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by the cultural icon of Rosie the Riveter. This demographic transformation had profound implications for post-war American society and foreign policy. The expanded role of women in wartime production created a more diverse and capable workforce, enhancing America's long-term competitive advantage in the global economy. Information drawn from the Smithsonian Institution's archives reveals how technological innovation accelerated during this period. The Manhattan Project, led by Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Richard Groves, represented the ultimate expression of America's newfound commitment to maintaining technological superiority over potential adversaries. The development of atomic weapons fundamentally altered strategic calculations and established the principle that American security required continuous investment in cutting-edge military technology. The financial mechanisms developed to fund this mobilization created new tools for international influence. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau, Jr. oversaw the sale of war bonds that not only financed American military expansion, but also demonstrated the government's ability to mobilize domestic resources for global commitments. The success of these financing mechanisms provided a model for the extensive foreign aid programs that would characterize post-war American foreign policy. Agricultural production, under the guidance of Secretary of Agriculture Claude Raymond Wickard, expanded to feed not only American forces, but also Allied populations worldwide. The concept of food as a diplomatic weapon, using agricultural abundance to support friends and pressure adversaries, became a permanent feature of American foreign policy. This agricultural diplomacy would later manifest in programs like Food for Peace and agricultural aid components of foreign assistance packages. The coordination of this massive mobilization required new forms of government organization that would persist long after the war's end. The Office of War Mobilization, headed by James Francis Burns, created precedents for centralized planning and resource allocation that influenced post-war national security structures. The success of wartime planning convinced American leaders that the federal government could effectively manage complex global commitments through careful coordination of economic, military, and diplomatic resources. By the end of 1942, America was producing nearly half of the world's munitions, demonstrating a capacity for sustained global engagement that had been unimaginable before Pearl Harbor. This industrial transformation provided the material foundation for America's post-war strategy of containing communism through economic strength, military superiority, and alliance building. The devastating losses at Pearl Harbor forced American military planners to fundamentally reconceptualize naval warfare and power projection in the Pacific. Admiral Chester William Nimitz, appointed to replace Admiral Kimmel as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, inherited a seemingly impossible mission: to advance across thousands of miles of ocean against a numerically superior enemy that had demonstrated its tactical superiority through the Pearl Harbor attack. The traditional doctrine of decisive battleship engagement, which had dominated naval thinking since the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, proved obsolete on December 7th. The sinking of the Arizona, Oklahoma, and other battleships demonstrated that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would determine naval supremacy in the modern era. This realization led to a complete restructuring of American naval strategy that would influence military planning for decades to come. Nimitz, working with his brilliant operations officer, Captain Charles Horatio McMorris, developed the concept of island hopping that would become the template for American power projection in the post-war era. Rather than attempting to capture every Japanese-held island, American forces would bypass heavily fortified positions, capturing only those bases necessary to support continued advances toward Japan. This strategy demonstrated that the United States could project power across vast distances through a combination of naval aviation, amphibious assault capabilities, and advanced logistics. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 marked the first implementation of this new doctrine. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's task force engaged the Japanese fleet in the world's first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft, with the opposing fleets never coming within sight of each other. Although tactically inconclusive, the battle demonstrated that American industrial capacity could rapidly replace losses, while Japanese resources remained finite. The decisive vindication of this new approach came at the Battle of Midway on June 4th through 7th, 1942. Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, utilized intelligence breakthroughs achieved by Commander Joseph John Rochefort's code-breaking team to position American forces for a devastating ambush of the Japanese fleet. The destruction of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a single day represented not just a tactical victory, but proof that American technological and industrial advantages could overcome initial Japanese superiority. General Douglas MacArthur's simultaneous campaign in the Southwest Pacific provided a complementary model for ground-based power projection. MacArthur's island-hopping strategy, supported by innovative amphibious warfare techniques developed by General Holland McTierre Smith, demonstrated how American forces could establish forward bases thousands of miles from the continental United States. These operations required unprecedented coordination between Army, Navy, and Army Air Force units, creating joint operational doctrines that would become standard in post-war American military organization. The logistics revolution that supported these operations was equally transformative. Admiral Ben Moriel's construction battalions, known as the Seabees, developed rapid base construction techniques that allowed American forces to establish airfields and naval facilities within days of securing an island. This capability for rapid infrastructure development became a crucial component of post-war American alliance relationships, as the United States could quickly establish military presence in allied nations. Intelligence operations, led by figures like Colonel William Friedman of the Army Security Agency, demonstrated the crucial importance of information warfare in modern conflict. The ability to intercept and decode Japanese communications provided American commanders with unprecedented insight into enemy intentions, allowing smaller American forces to achieve decisive victories against larger Japanese formations. The Pacific Campaign's emphasis on technological innovation created new industries and capabilities that would define American military superiority in the post-war era. The development of radar, sonar, and advanced communications equipment gave American forces decisive advantages that would be maintained through continuous research and development programs extending far beyond the war's end. The Pearl Harbor attack catalyzed a fundamental transformation in American alliance relationships that extended far beyond the immediate requirements of wartime cooperation. The Roosevelt administration, freed from isolationist constraints, began constructing a global network of partnerships that would become the foundation of American hegemony in the post-war world. The Atlantic Charter, negotiated between Roosevelt and Churchill aboard the USS Augusta in August 1941, now became the blueprint for a new international order. Secretary of State Hull, working with British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, expanded these principles into a comprehensive framework for post-war cooperation. The Four Freedoms speech, delivered by Roosevelt in January 1941, provided the ideological foundation for American global leadership based on democratic values and economic prosperity. The alliance with the Soviet Union, despite fundamental ideological differences, demonstrated America's newfound willingness to work with any partner necessary to achieve strategic objectives. Harry Lloyd Hopkins, Roosevelt's personal envoy to Joseph Stalin, negotiated massive Lend-Lease assistance that would total over $11 billion by war's end. This cooperation, while temporary, established precedents for American engagement with ideologically diverse partners when strategic interests aligned. The China-Burma-India Theater, under the command of General Joseph Warren Stilwell, illustrated both the opportunities and limitations of American global engagement. Stilwell's difficult relationship with Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek highlighted the challenges inherent in supporting allies whose internal policies conflicted with American values. This experience provided crucial lessons about the complexities of alliance management that would influence American policy throughout the Cold War. The development of combined operations with British forces created new models for international military cooperation. General Dwight David Eisenhower's success in coordinating multinational forces in Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, demonstrated that American leadership could effectively manage complex alliance relationships under combat conditions. These experiences directly influenced the creation of NATO and other post-war alliance structures. The Pacific War Council, established in Washington to coordinate Allied strategy against Japan, brought together representatives from Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, China, and other nations fighting Japanese expansion. Prime Minister John Curtin of Australia and Prime Minister Peter Fraser of New Zealand developed particularly close relationships with American military leaders, establishing patterns of cooperation that would persist throughout the Cold War. Research from the National Security Archive demonstrates how Pearl Harbor transformed American thinking about collective security. The failure of the League of Nations to prevent the Second World War convinced American leaders that international organizations required American participation and leadership to be effective. This recognition led to active American involvement in designing the United Nations, with Eleanor Roosevelt playing a crucial role in crafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The technological sharing agreements negotiated during the war created precedents for post-war scientific cooperation. The exchange of radar technology with Britain, the joint development of sonar systems, and cooperation in nuclear research established patterns of technological alliance that would become central to American security relationships. These agreements demonstrated that American technological superiority could be maintained and enhanced through selective cooperation with trusted allies. The economic integration achieved through Lend-Lease and other wartime programs created new forms of influence that extended beyond traditional military power. American economic aid came with requirements for recipient nations to adopt compatible economic policies, establishing precedents for the conditional aid programs that would characterize American foreign policy throughout the Cold War era. The attack on Pearl Harbor's most profound legacy lay not in the immediate military consequences, but in its complete transformation of American strategic culture and global responsibilities. By the war's end in 1945, the United States had evolved from a reluctant participant in international affairs to the architect of a new global order based on American leadership and democratic principles. The Truman Doctrine, announced by President Harry S. Truman in March 1947, represented the culmination of the strategic transformation that began at Pearl Harbor. Truman's commitment to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures extended American security guarantees far beyond the Western Hemisphere. This global commitment would have been politically impossible without the fundamental shift in American strategic thinking catalyzed by the Pearl Harbor attack. General Marshall, as Secretary of State under Truman, implemented the European Recovery Program that bore his name. The Marshall Plan represented the practical application of lessons learned from Pearl Harbor, that American security required global economic stability and democratic governance. The $13 billion committed to European reconstruction demonstrated America's willingness to use economic power as an instrument of foreign policy on an unprecedented scale. The creation of NATO in 1949 marked the institutionalization of alliance relationships first forged in the crucible of the Second World War. General Eisenhower's appointment as NATO's first Supreme Allied Commander reflected the continuity between wartime cooperation and peacetime alliance management. The Article 5 commitment to collective defense represented a permanent American guarantee that would have been unthinkable before Pearl Harbor demonstrated the costs of American isolation. Dean Gooderham Acheson, Hull's successor as Secretary of State, articulated the doctrine of containment that would guide American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. The recognition that American security required active resistance to hostile ideologies anywhere in the world represented the complete abandonment of isolationist principles. The National Security Act of 1947, creating the Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Council, provided the institutional framework for managing global commitments. The nuclear revolution, initiated by the Manhattan Project's response to Pearl Harbor, fundamentally altered strategic calculations. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 demonstrated American willingness to use overwhelming force to achieve strategic objectives. More importantly, America's temporary nuclear monopoly provided the security umbrella under which the new international order could be established. According to analyses preserved in the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library, Pearl Harbor's psychological impact persisted long after the war's end. The memory of December 7th created a national consensus supporting whatever military spending and international commitments were necessary to prevent another surprise attack. This consensus enabled the massive defense expenditures of the Cold War era and sustained American global presence through multiple conflicts and crises. The intelligence community created in response to Pearl Harbor evolved into a permanent global surveillance network. The establishment of the National Security Agency in 1952 represented the institutionalization of the signals intelligence capabilities first demonstrated at Midway. The CIA's covert operations, controversial though they often became, reflected the lesson that American security required active engagement with global political developments rather than passive response to emerging threats. The Pearl Harbor attack's ultimate legacy was the creation of what historian Henry Robinson Luce termed the American Century. The global network of military bases, alliance relationships, economic partnerships, and international institutions established in response to December 7th created a framework for American hegemony that persisted through the Cold War and beyond. The isolationist republic that had been attacked on that quiet Sunday morning in 1941 had been transformed into a global empire committed to maintaining international order through strength, prosperity, and democratic values. The lessons of Pearl Harbor, that distance no longer guaranteed security, that threats must be engaged before they fully materialized, and that American prosperity required global stability, became the foundational principles of American grand strategy. These principles would guide American foreign policy through the challenges of the Cold War, the complexities of decolonization, and the emergence of new global threats in the 21st century. The date that lived in infamy had become the birth date of modern American power.